All right, live.
It's on. I'll be standing here if you want to
Yeah.
give that to me in a second.
Okay, can I have your attention, please? Yeah, thank you. So I just want to add my own welcome to all of you and thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest and support of our work. Larry is going to, in a couple of minutes, say this more eloquently, of course, but I do want to say that in where we are now, in terms of the consensus about what is development and how to engage with the process of development, fraying not just here in ways that are so visible, but more broadly in many, many parts of the world, I think it is an important time for us to ask ourselves some of the questions about what it is that we can do to think about development now. And I'm hoping that's what Larry will address in the talk he's going to give. But it also means that the work that we do here at the Center for Global Development and the work that actually many of you do in other ways becomes even more needed now than it has ever been. So I do want to thank you for your support for that. I also want to say on a personal note that this is actually the first time that I have the privilege of welcoming all of you to this annual dinner, and I want to take this opportunity publicly to thank all of my colleagues at CGD, and especially Nancy for the support that they have given me during this transition, and also all the members of the board, many of whom are here tonight for their support. So thank you all very much for that. And now, without further ado, I think this is the moment for me to welcome Larry and invite him to give us his remarks.
Thank you, Masood, for that extraordinarily lengthy and fulsome introduction, which I shall remember well when it comes time for your annual review and shall fully reflect the great skill and felicity with which you introduced me. I am really glad to be with all the people in this room. CGD's work is thinking and doing on the problems and challenges of economic development. And I believe that the development environment is more different today than it probably has been at any moment in the last generation. You can argue that it was an equally different world after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, I suppose. But there certainly has been no comparable discontinuity since that time. And that means that the questions we ask have to change. And if the questions we ask change, then it's almost certain that the answers we get and the policies we recommend will change as well. And so I think the work of CGD is exceptionally important at this interval. That's why I'm honored to be the board chair, enormously respectful of the work that was done for many years under Nancy Birdsall's leadership, and with great anticipation for the work that's being done by you, Masood, and by all of your colleagues. And what I want to do tonight is to reflect with you for a little while on just what it is that I think is different, and just what I think that says about the development agenda going forward. I think the place to start and the place to linger a bit, because in all the doom and all the gloom and all the concern, we tend to forget it, is that emerging markets have, in a profound sense, emerged over the last generation. There has been more convergence between poor people in poor countries and rich people in rich countries over the last generation than in any generation in human history. You know, the dramatic way to say it is that between the time of Pericles and London in 1800, standards of living rose about 75% in 2,300 years. And that they called it the Industrial Revolution because for the first time in human history, standards of living were visibly and meaningfully different at the end of a human lifespan than they had been at the beginning of a human lifespan, perhaps 50% higher during the Industrial Revolution. 50% is the growth that's been achieved in a variety of 6-year periods in China over the last generation, and in many other countries as well. And so if you look at material standards of living, we have seen more progress for more people and more catching up than ever before. That is not simply about things that are material and things that are reflected in GDP. The primary message of the Global Health 2035 report that I co-authored several years ago and that Amanda and others from CGD were involved in was that if current trends continue with significant effort from the global community, it is reasonable to hope that in 2035, the global child mortality rate will be lower than the US child mortality rate was when my children were born in 1990. That is a staggering human achievement. It is already the case that in large parts of China, life expectancy is greater than it is in large parts of the United States. One can tell a similar story in terms of literacy, and probably an even stronger story in terms of the rights of women. Extreme poverty is now a phenomenon not of countries that just happen to be poor. It is a phenomenon that reflects pockets of poverty in countries that overall have reasonable incomes, like India or China. And it is a phenomenon of fragile and dysfunctional states that do not have effective governments. It is not a phenomenon of generalized poverty of countries that do not lack resources. And so we have made incredible progress in the last generation. And if we do as well over the next generation, that generation will be one of the two best generations in human history in terms of poverty reduction. And so as we move to a discussion of how dark it is in populism in industrial countries and all the things I'm about to talk about, we should not lose sight of that hugely positive reality, which will be the primary thing that historians who look at this time in terms of these questions in 2300 see. Second thing I want to say in terms of how the world is right now is a more painful and more difficult thing. And that is that the alignment of interest between the United States and the developing world, as perceived by Americans, is greatly diminished from where it was a generation ago. That's for two broad reasons. In part, it's because we are no longer engaged in the Cold War and the associated struggle for allegiance and the associated idea that if developing countries succeeded with our capitalist market system, then they'd be on our side, not their side. And therefore, we had a huge stake in our success because we were involved in a global struggle. They were our allies, and we needed them to succeed. There's no parallel global struggle of the same kind today. And therefore, the kind of idea, I mean, if you think about it, it's actually quite a remarkable idea. John Kennedy, speaking albeit more about the military dimension than about the economic dimension, said, with respect to developing countries, we will, and I quote, bear any burden and pay any price to assure the success of liberty. And then he paused and he said, all of this and more. Now, Vietnam had something to do with why we moved away from that, but the fact that there's no existential struggle that has children hiding under doing drills hiding under their desks has something to do with a very different attitude towards development. The second difference that is related, second reason for this misalignment is a consequence of the very success that I just described. There was no economic threat that was important to the United States from the developing world a generation ago. Yes, if you were a textile worker, you were worried about imported shirts. Yes, if you were a shoe worker, you were worried about imported shoes. But for the most part, there was very little that was happening in the developing world that was a competitive challenge to substantial sized interests in the United States. That is not a plausible assertion today. I believe there is a great confusion in the economic policy discussion. The truth is that trade has had substantial effects on the American income distribution and substantial effects on large numbers of American workers. The untruth is that trade agreements have had substantial impacts on American workers and the American income distribution. The reality is that the American market has been almost completely open for 40 years. And what's happened is that developing countries have become much more productive and much more efficient, and it's become much more possible to move goods at low cost and to export efficient production technologies to developing countries. And that would have happened with or without trade agreements. And the trade agreements have been good deals because they've opened the other countries' markets much more than they've opened ours, mostly because ours was already open. But the consequence is that economic interests are much less aligned than they previously were. Moreover, China represents an extraordinary and in many ways unprecedented situation. It is, I believe, without historical precedent for the world's largest economy to have average standards of living that are 25% of the world's high frontier in terms of standards of living. And it is, I believe, without precedent for a country with 25% of frontier standards of living to have a range of global companies that are at or beyond the cutting edge in key technologies. Take two examples. Alipay, there's a range of views. There would be those who would say that Alipay is 3 years ahead of PayPal and American fintech. And there would be those who would say that it was 10 years ahead of American fintech. There would be no one knowledgeable who would say that in a range of spheres, they were not ahead of American fintech. And if you think about the phrase fintech, those are two things we think of the United States as being extremely good at. A similar case can be made for other parts of Alibaba, for WeChat, for a range of other Chinese companies. And so the idea that the success of the developing world is an obvious positive objective of U.S. economic policy is not as readily apparent to the current generation as it was to previous generations. And that is not an entirely irrational feeling on their part. The third framing reality that I want you to think about is that our money, and I mean by that our assistance and the assistance of the multilateral institutions in which we have great leverage, is much less significant than it once was. Perhaps the best way to convey that is with a story. In 1991, when I was new to all of this and was working as the chief economist of the World Bank, the first really important situation in which I had any visibility at all was the Indian financial crisis that took place in the summer of 1991. And at that point, India was near the brink. It was so near the brink that, at least as I recall the story, $1 billion of gold was, with great secrecy, put on a ship by the Indians to be transported to London, where it could be collateral for an emergency loan that would permit the Indian government to meet its payroll at the end of the month. And at that moment, the World Bank was in a position over the next year to lend India $3 billion in conjunction with its economic reform program. And the United States had an important role in shaping the World Bank's strategy. Well, that $3 billion was hugely important to the destiny of a sixth of humanity. Today, the World Bank would have the capacity to lend India in a year $6 or $7 billion. But India has $380 billion, $380 billion in reserves, dominantly invested in Treasury bills, earning 1%. And India itself has a foreign aid budget of $5 or $6 billion. And so the relevance of the kind of flows that we are in a position to provide officially to major countries is simply not what it once was. Now, in many ways, that is a reflection of the success I described earlier. If India had not converged substantially, if emerging markets had not emerged, they wouldn't have anything like those quantities of reserves. But the reality is that realities that frame thinking about economic development then are, it's working for most emerging markets. The idea that simply making it work, the idea that people should be taxed heavily to make it work better is a much less intuitive idea politically for deep reasons in the current context than it ever was before. And the capacity for marginal money to make a major difference in major places is vastly less than it ever was before. And I would suggest that it's that thinking that needs to inform our thinking about development going forward. What would be principles that need to be very important for us in thinking about development going forward? I would suggest 5. First, providing money for tasks that governments are already carrying on a significant scale is unlikely to be enormously impactful. In part, that's a matter of the arithmetic that I just described. In part, that's a matter of the unspoken word in much of development economics, which is fungibility. I remember as a young economist who was going to be the chief economist of the World Bank, sitting and talking with Stan Fisher, who was my predecessor as the chief economist of the World Bank. And we were talking, and I was new to all this. I'd never done anything in the official sector. And I said, Stan, I don't get it. If a country has 5 infrastructure projects and the World Bank can fund 2 of them, and the World Bank's going to cost benefit analyze, and the World Bank's going to do all its stuff, I would assume what the country does is show the World Bank its 2 best infrastructure projects, because that will be easiest. And if it gets money from the World Bank, then it does 1 more project. But what the World Bank's actually buying is not the project it's being shown, it's the marginal product that it is enabling. And so why do we make such a fuss of evaluating the particular quality of our projects? And Stan listened to me, and he looked at me. He's a very wise man. And he said, Larry, you know, it's really interesting. When I first got to the bank, I always asked questions like that. But now I've been here for 2 years, and I don't ask questions like that. I just kind of think about the projects, because it's kind of too hard and too painful to ask questions like that. Well, the story's a little unfair to me, and it's a little unfair to Stan, and it's a little unfair to various things the bank does, and it's the reason bank gets involved in sectors. But it still captures a deep truth that we tend not to face when we think about what it is that we are financing. So there's one other way to make this point, which I was kind of struck by when I taught my class on globalization this semester. I gave a lecture on where I talked a lot about the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is the great historical success of foreign aid. And if you Google the word Marshall Plan, you can find calls within the last 2 years for 12 different Marshall Plans. You know, a Marshall Plan for America's cities, a Marshall Plan for Appalachia, a Marshall Plan for Africa, a Marshall Plan for Puerto Rico. I mean, everybody who wants to help someplace calls for a Marshall Plan for that place, because the Marshall Plan is the great positive inspiring feature of foreign aid. Well, here's the remarkable fact that I had not appreciated. The Marshall Plan lasted 4 years, and during those 4 years, it represented about 4% of the GDP of the countries that were receiving assistance. Now, there are several dozen countries this year that are receiving more than 4% of GDP in assistance and have received more than 4% of GDP in assistance for a decade. If you take a troubled area, an area that's recovering from conflict, an area that needs to be reconstructed, like Europe did after World War II. If you take Bosnia in the decade after the struggles there, or you take parts of the Middle East, you take a standard World Bank needs assessment. You know, there's been a civil war in a country. The civil war got settled. We're going to have a donors conference. The World Bank convenes to prepare a needs assessment. I can save you the trouble. The needs assessment will be between 1/3 of GNP and 1/2 of GDP for the affected region for 5 years per year. 10 times the Marshall Plan. Now, what that reflects is that the Marshall Plan was actually a different context, that reconstruction is very different from development, but the message that you can simply solve the problems by moving fungible money in is probably not realistic. And so I would say the first lesson is that we need to think in increasingly different ways than traditional mobilize more money for foreign assistance. And the first bit of advice I gave Masood as he was thinking about his agenda was, I said, the largest share of CGD reports has to not be a new rationale for more foreign aid to countries about a given objective without any change in existing foreign aid. The second reality is that this is not a rationale for less development spending. This is a rationale for the same amount of development spending that we have, or for more development spending, because there is a different agenda, an agenda where fungibility is much less of a problem, and an agenda where the returns are probably even higher. And that is the sphere of global public goods. The level of investment in new agricultural technologies, the level of investment in developing responses to the next pandemic. And by the way, it is at least even money that sometime in this century there will be something comparable to the 1919 flu epidemic that killed 2.5 times as many people as World War I. And if that comes, it is an open question whether the fact that we have modern science will help us more than the fact that we have modern intercommunication between places hurts us. And the current WHO budget for pandemic flu is less than the salary of the University of Michigan's football coach. And that seems, not to mention any number of people who work in hedge funds. And that seems manifestly inappropriate. And we do not yet have any settled consensus on how we are going to deal with global public goods and how that is going to be funded. We have this sentence that I and many others have uttered many times: the global development banks need to shift their focus increasingly to global public goods. Good sentence, really good sentence. There's a problem, which is when you lend money to India, especially when you lend money to India when it has its $380 billion of reserves, then whether the project works or whether the project doesn't exactly work, India is probably going to pay you back. But when you invest money in hiring a bunch of scientists to develop a standby capacity to deal with the next pandemic, there is no pecuniary source of revenue to pay you back. And it is much more expensive to spend money than it is to lend money to the relative creditworthy. And we have not achieved any meaningful consensus on large-scale commitments to funding of global public goods by the major countries. It was treated as a great achievement at one of the summits, and in its way, it was a great achievement when the countries of the world all organized themselves to spend $100 million or so buying a $500 million policy of insurance, of reinsurance, that would address pandemics. Well, against any pandemic of any size, $500 million is roughly nothing. And this was like the big outcome from the heads of state of the world coming together to show that they could deal with global public goods. How we're going to mobilize support around global public goods, where the resources are going to be adequate around global public goods, I would suggest is the second very large priority for the years ahead. Third, the management of global private sector integration. And I choose those words quite carefully. We have these agreements that we call trade agreements, that we call free trade agreements, and that we associate with the greats of economics like David Ricardo and Ann Kruger, who have made the case through many years and made a compelling and persuasive case for free trade. And they are, with some exceptions that the economics profession understands and that for most purposes are not hugely important, theirs is an overwhelming case that erecting tariff or quota barriers to trade between countries is usually a bad idea. Most of those in today's world have gone away. And most of the content of what we now call free trade agreements beyond where we are now is not about the removal of those kinds of barriers. It's about, for example, securing intellectual property protection for global companies in a wider range of countries. Or it's about achieving access for service companies to a wider range of countries. Or it's about harmonizing rules in areas like safety standards or financial reporting standards. All of those things may be good or they may be bad, but they are not self-evidently and clearly good in the way that free trade is clearly good. And part of the reason there is a sense that there's a bit of a swindle going on is that the prestige of free trade is being arrogated in support of a rather different agenda of better, more harmonized commercial rules, with a sense that the participants in the debate about what constitute better, more harmonized commercial rules are mostly the kinds of people who appear in Davos rather than the kinds of people who work in the companies that are run by the people who appear in Davos. And there is a suspicion of that agenda. Let's take a different issue. It is an issue that is mentioned in international economic dialogue, but not with nearly the emphasis, prestige, or political attention that is assigned to so-called free trade issues. And that's the set of issues pointed up by the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers. The substantial avoidance or evasion, choose your preferred word, and it's fine if you choose whichever one you think of as the lesser sin, that takes place. There is no reason why preventing a race to the bottom in the taxation of mobile capital should not be an equally important priority for those concerned with international integration as the dissemination of intellectual property protection or the protection of investors' rights or the establishment of the right to branch. And that is an issue that, because revenues not obtained in one place have to be obtained in another place, that speaks very directly to the economic interests of broad publics everywhere. So I would describe as a third priority, without knowing exactly how it's done, the recasting of the current debates about free trade, which really aren't about free trade, as debates about the management of international economic harmonization to the benefit of middle-class people everywhere. Fourth issue that I would highlight, and I can highlight its importance more credibly than I can speak intelligently about it, is addressing the set of issues having to do with the movement of peoples. It is, on the one hand, the case, and it is the point that economists emphasize, that if you think about the size of the barrier that represented by the difference between the price of a car here and the price of a car there, or the price of a shirt here and the price of a shirt there, and you look at that barrier as a percentage, or you look at the cost of money here and the price of cost of money there, and you look at that as a percentage and you measure the barrier. And then you look at the wage rate for an equivalent worker in one place and in another place. The barrier, the imperfection relative to full mobility and full openness is an order of magnitude greater with respect to the movement of people than it is with respect to the movement of capital or the movement of goods. And that is the globalist, pure economic case for much freer movement of people than we have today. At the same time, there is the tension represented by the fact that while it might be difficult for moral philosophers to fully justify and understand, most of us care more about our children than our nephews, and most of us care more about our nephews than we care about our friends' children, and most of us care more about our friends' children than we care about strangers' children, and most of us care more about other American children than we care about children in other countries. And so an agenda of collective globalization is an agenda that is in tension with bringing out the most generous impulses within us. And how we manage that tension is, I think, central going forward. I would like to see a world in which there is more movement of peoples, a world in which there are more opportunities for us to prosper and developing countries to prosper through more mobility, temporary or permanent, of peoples. I find the CGD work pointing up the magnitude of those barriers to be highly persuasive. But at the same time, if the consequence of that is a backlash against generosity and a turn towards a hyper-truculent nationalism, it's not going to work. And so I don't know what the solution is, but I don't think there's a more important development issue than getting questions of migration right, especially in a world where the growth rate of the industrial world's labor force over the next 40 years is going to be zero, and where that reality will not be changed and indeed will be exacerbated, if we think of China as entering the industrial world over those 40 years. And the last challenge is, how are we going to shape a world in which China is going to loom large and ever larger? The sums of money that appear to be on the offing around One Belt, One Road dwarf the kinds of sums of money that we talk about when we talk about new U.S. assistance initiatives, or even when we talk about new World Bank initiatives, or frankly, when we talk about the entire lending budget of the World Bank. Right now, I would describe the modus vivendi that the world has found as being parallel play. The West does its thing, China does its thing, countries get a bunch of money from China and they do it China's way, countries get a bunch of money from us and they do it our way, and we all sort of move forward together, and periodically we have some dialogue with China about how this system's going to work, and everybody's very polite to everybody else. I'm not sure that that's going to work when nobody's alive who remembers the tradition of Bretton Woods, and when China's GDP is 75% greater than the US GDP. And so the last challenge, I would say, is, what is the deal? What is the system of global governance in which the United States and the West and China are all going to participate in in common. I've by now had a chance to be part of any number of groups of Americans discussing strategy towards particular regions or strategy towards particular countries. And what I've noticed is that there's a strong tendency for people, it seems to me, to confuse a strategy with a wish list. Our strategy is that it's very important that they open their markets, that it's very important that they cooperate with us on this security issue, that it's very important that they have a better attitude towards our companies that are investing in their country, and 3 other things. Well, it's a good wish list, but a wish list is not a strategy. A strategy needs to be something that's feasible, and probably they're deciding to adopt our wish list because we say our wish list louder and more firmly, does not constitute a strategy. And I don't think we as yet have a strategy for thinking about the management of the global economic system that is appropriately respectful of the scale and achievements of the Chinese economy. So I want to end where I started by saying that with all the challenges that are ahead, if we keep the development trend of the last generation going substantially, even if not completely, we will do very well. But that keeping it going is going to require a great deal of new thinking that's not primarily going to be about giving foreign aid to countries, but is instead going to be about mobilizing them around global common interests on significant scale, around managing global economic integration in a way that is in the interests of all citizens, that thinks about the movement of peoples differently, is making far smaller, and that in a world that engages in a much more serious way with China on questions of global economic policy than we have so far. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Larry. Excellent, excellent speech. Very, very interesting, very thought-provoking. In the few minutes we have left, I'm going to take a couple of comments from people. I might pick on a couple of people just to get things going, but then please do kind of raise your hands. We've got a microphone going around. We might get a few more comments. And if you want to ask a couple of questions, I'll jot them down and maybe Larry can give us some thoughts on that afterwards. So I think, first of all, Andrew Steer, if I may come to you. So I caught you off guard there, I know. I know you're paying attention. This issue of global public goods that Larry was talking about, he posed a question: how do we mobilize resources around global public goods? So I wondered if you could just give us your thoughts briefly. Not for long, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you for a hypothesis. Brief comments. There's a microphone coming to you just over there.
First, Larry, absolutely fantastic. Congratulations, Masood, Nancy. CGD is the best think tank in the world thinking about the bigger issues in development. Those of you on the board, thank you for what you're doing. Don't stop. Give more money and make this institution even greater. Larry, your 5 points. By the way, I had no idea you were going to ask me to speak. Larry, your 5 points are absolutely terrific. I'm going to ask a different question to the one you asked. I'm about to leave for Bonn, where we have the climate change meetings. This year, the American Pavilion in Bonn, which is the annual big, will probably be bigger than ever, by the way. And every penny of it, I believe, is being paid for by states, cities, and the private sector. And what's happened since Trump pulled out of Paris is that you've had more backbone and more enthusiasm and more drive to address climate change in this country than actually we had before. That's actually, there's a more general point here, Larry, and I want to ask your thoughts on this. The big questions in the world today need to be solved only partly by governments, but actually more interestingly, by the private sector. So if it's deforestation in East Asia, it's about palm oil, and it's actually citizens buying palm oil. It's Paul Pullman at Unilever. It's institutions like ours that measure whether or not forests are declining. And yes, you do need governments and so on. So my question for you, Larry, in your 5 issues, my sense is that CGD needs to be thinking also about the new sort of essentially sort of governance in the world. I mean, whether it's the Facebooks and the Googles, but actually the role of central governments is still incredibly important. But my sense is that the development agencies are still paying more attention to central governments and not enough attention to those who make real decisions. And it's the kind of thing we ought to be looking for is what, for example, DFID, the UK Development Agency, did, say, 8 years ago, putting $1 million into Safaricom, owned by Vodafone, which led to M-Pesa, which led to 100 million people now using cell phone banking. And so I'd be really interested in your thinking on this.
I might take a couple more points, Larry, and then we can come back for a response. Thank you, Andrew. For someone who was unprepared to speak, did a very good job there. Let's pick up another point that Larry was talking about. Point number 4, you were talking about managing the movement of people, but importantly, the tensions around the movement of people. And Nazanin Ash from IRC, I wonder if I could put you on the spot here. Give us a brief kind of like a couple of thoughts about this. How do we do this?
I suspect that Michael Clemens is a better responder on that question. But I do think it goes back to something that Andrew mentioned. I think we need new global governance models for how we think about the movement of people. On the humanitarian front, which I know best, we see a global retreat from humanitarian obligations. And that displacement and the poor management of it and the poor response to it is so much of what's throwing up more and more walls. You know, Brexit in one way can be described as a political crisis that was a function of the poor management of the massive displacement of Syrian refugees. There's no reason why the arrival of a tiny proportion compared to the population of Europe should have caused so much of a political backlash. But it was about the lack of governance mechanisms, institutional mechanisms for making decisions about how a collection of states was going to respond to an influx of people with tremendous need, but also with tremendous potential.
Okay, thank you, Naz. Let's get one more point on another theme. Shamini Kuri from IMF, I wonder if we can come to you. Sorry, Amanda, she's right on the other side of the room. What is the deal, Larry asked at the end? What is the new system of global governance? Sorry, this is the kind of big question, no pressure. What is this new system of global governance that is going to see all countries united and playing by the same rules in the future, given the growth of China?
Let me, look, Larry, I want to thank you for really some thought-provoking remarks. And before, I think, one perspective I have is, we can talk about global governance systems, and you just asked me about that. But I still think that, the statement, all politics are local, a real development is still, I would like to say, is a local phenomenon, meaning I'm suggesting that it's important for governments to be effective, that is, capable governments. Global governance has to be, in the end, constructed on capable governments at the national level. If you don't have that, then global governance will not work very well. So one thought, I want to offer is, what is the role that the international community has? In this regard, we have information technology now. Everyone has access to the internet, or most people do. It's amazing. Someone mentioned M-Pesa. M-Pesa. So we have countries that are really capable of informing themselves, that are, in relative terms quite poor. But what potential is there to harness these technologies to make governments more capable at the sort of the national level? Larry, you talked about pandemics. If you have, how do we harness the knowledge that exists in this world to have better healthcare at the village level? If you don't have capable governments, you cannot achieve that. So I do think that there is this link from effective national governments to the global, effective global governance. And my question, which I'd like to hear your views, Larry, is there an opportunity here to use technology to somehow bring a change from the way we are currently doing aid, or the international involvement with national governments? So I'm going to turn your views the other way and try to look at what can we do that's not just about money. It's about harnessing more capable institutions at the national level.
Okay, I'm going to quickly say, if anybody else has any more comments, 30 seconds each. I'm going to give you a chance right now. Otherwise, I'm just going to turn over to Larry and can give us some concluding comments, and then we'll close it out. Anybody? Owen Barder. Okay, it's 30 seconds, Owen. Just let you know. There's a microphone coming around to you. Actually, here, take mine.
Less than 30 seconds. What about conflict?
Okay. That's three words packed with quite a lot in there. Anybody else? Karen Atkinson.
Just very quickly, your comment about China and One Belt, One Road focused on how big the money might be from then. But your first point had been get over thinking about the money that you give to governments. So I wonder if there aren't other issues rather than the foreign assistance from China that will be more important for us to think about.
Okay, I think, Larry, that's plenty for you to be responding to, so let me turn it over to you.
I thought everything that was said was terrifically thoughtful and caused me regret that I hadn't spoken more thoughtfully about the issues that were raised. Let me take a few of them. Conflict in fragile states, I think, is a huge issue, and it points up a broader issue. I was in a conversation today with someone who I had worked with many years ago, who had been an aide to Anatoly Chubais working on Russia. And his claim, which I thought was right, was we'd gotten a bunch of things wrong, but in the broad, what the world had said to Russia about how to become a market economy had been broadly right and had been broadly reasonably effective. And what the world tried to do to give Russia advice and guidance on how to become a democracy had been an abject and complete failure. And the broader point was that while economists don't agree on anything, and while economic science is highly imperfect, and while there are a ton of debates, and while the Washington consensus has broken down, the degree of understanding with which we approach reforming an economy is substantially greater than the degree of understanding with which we approach making a fragile state less fragile. And that's a huge intellectual challenge. And we don't even, I suspect there are a lot of problems with the David Petraeus manual for how to do counterinsurgency. But I don't think the civilian versions of that, which is kind of how to repair fragile states, we don't even have a manual. We don't even have a manual that's a starting place for debate in terms of what to do around fragile states. And so I think this whole set of issues around fragile states is a hugely important area for research because it is a hugely important area for the world, because that's where a lot of the conflict is going to come from. That's where a fair amount of the source of terrorism is going to come from. That's where a lot of the poverty is. So I think you're absolutely right. And if I'd had room for a sixth point, that probably would have been it. Chamonix was I had the great good fortune to have Chamonix as a student. I don't know, what is it, almost 40 years, almost 40 years ago, and everything she said was hugely sensible then, and everything she says is hugely sensible now. I agree with your skeptical comments about global governance. I don't think there's a way of reading the European experience other than to say that the appetite for global institutions to have more power, whatever the people in this room think, is just not there. And so I think the search for solutions probably should not run through ideas that have as a central element that national governments are going to cede authority to supranational institutions, because I think that is not so likely to actually happen. I agree with you in general about the importance of technology, and I think governments need to figure out how to get smarter about it. Somebody remarked on how somebody had given $1 million and that had led to the M-Pesa development. I am deeply skeptical, based on considerable knowledge, and I express this opinion with more confidence than most of the opinions I've expressed, that governments are not good at venture capital, will not be good at venture capital, and should not attempt venture capital. And so when you are talking about some kind of innovation that, if successful, will provide substantial economic returns, the odds that governments will be substantially good at funding it, I think, are quite low. And I think the US efforts to be a venture capitalist in clean energy were pretty dismal. And I would think the US government would be better at it than most. So in general, I think that governments should concentrate their investments on areas where the primary returns from the investment is not going to be pecuniary. And so mobile payments would seem to me to be a quintessential example of an area where I would be very skeptical of a substantial government role in investment. Designing better information technology systems so that government agricultural extension workers can extend agriculture much better, I think that's a very good thing. In general, I think the lesson of software procurement, I mean, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I was involved in the IRS is fixing itself. I would say the broad lesson is, you're much better off using off-the-shelf applications than you are developing your own. And everybody thinks they should develop their own. And so I think governments need to do that, but they need to do it more by buying it and less by making it than tends to be their natural inclination. I'm sympathetic to the broad ideas that Andrew talked about. I guess the more I see, the more impressed I am by the power of transparency about statistics to make people care about things that they wouldn't otherwise care about. Lyndon Johnson basically explained forcefully to his economic advisors that he really didn't, I won't quote exactly what he said, but the first two words were "give a," whether the poverty line was or was not an accurate reflection of anything about poverty. He really didn't care at all. What he cared about was, if there was a poverty line and there was a measurement each year of the number of people in poverty, the country would be very focused on having there be less poverty. and therefore he wanted there to be a poverty line. And an unacceptable answer to him was we couldn't meaningfully compute a poverty line because it was too complicated. And I think that's an instructive lesson for economic researchers everywhere. So I agree with you completely about transparency. I am a bit more skeptical of some of this altruistic business stuff. And I think there is some tendency in the nonprofit sector for some business to be avoiding $1.5 billion of taxes with some caper in the Cayman Islands and spending $25 million on a clean water program somewhere and $15 million promoting the $25 million they spent on the clean water program and explaining that they're really great, virtuous heroes working to combat global poverty. And I just think we need to be a little slightly more tough-minded than we tend to be, and that there's probably more greenwashing going on among global corporations than we who are eager to embrace altruistic movements tend to see. So I support the subject, I support the pressure, but I think we need to be a little bit more tough-minded in evaluating how good the things are. And I would suggest as an area for statistics, every corporation needs to report how much it spends doing good and how much it spends making visible the good that it does, and some scrutiny when that ratio gets to be too high. I don't have anything really to add to your thoughtful remarks on migration. I have a feeling we better find a solution other than global governance, because I think if the solution is supposed to be global governance that's going to tell the United States or tell other major countries how many immigrants they're going to take or how they have to protect the immigrants they have, I think that the Brexit vote told you what the world's reaction to that was going to be. And so I think that's unlikely to be going to be the ultimate solution. Did I miss anybody? Did I miss any of the questions? Carolyn, your question, I'm sorry.
My question.
What was it about?
Mine
Just
was about
remind me.
China.
Oh, yeah. You're probably right that the way I framed it in terms of the amount of money they were spending was not the right way. It was not the right way to have framed it, given the other things I said. On the other hand, if you really get behind my Marshall Plan example, what you find is that it was a little money plus a lot of dialogue and a lot of subtle pressure. And that's kind of what's going on with One Belt, One Road. And the amount of money that's involved may tell you something about the scale of the effort. And I don't think One Belt, One Road is money without a lot of discussion of our shared destiny between the places. And I agree with you that some of the shared destiny talk may be more important than the money talk. But I don't know what the number is, but there's something like $50 or $60 billion of Chinese money in Venezuela. And that has to tell you something about what the potential is for having substantial influence. Look, if you think I'm right, that's terrific. If you think I'm wrong, that's terrific too, because it points up the kind of hugely important issues that CGD can explore. The one thing I'm very confident of is that the development discussions of 2025 are going to look very, very different than the development discussions of 2015. Thank you very much.